Madam President, to date, America has lost nearly 150,000 people who have died with diseases related to coronavirus. We are quickly approaching 5 million cases of infections in the United States of America. Consider this for a moment. The United States has 5% of the world's population. We have almost 25% of all the COVID infections in the world. How did we reach this point, that we have such a rampant rate of infection in what's considered the most developed nation on earth? Part of the problem is a president who peddles worthless medical advice, and part of the problem is that the Republican Senate has been unwilling to face the economic hardships which have been created by this pandemic in our economy. It was 10 and a half weeks ago, the House of Representatives, under Democratic control and Speaker Pelosi, passed the HEROES Act. 10 and a half weeks ago, they knew this day was coming, when the unemployment benefits that we put in the original legislation would expire, as they will this week, when the help for those who were renting to meet their obligations would expire, as it did last week. So 10 and a half weeks ago, Speaker Pelosi put on the table her proposal to deal with America after these things occurred. Today on the floor of the Senate, Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, called her efforts, quote, a loony ideological fantasy. Loony ideological fantasy. Well, the obvious question to Senator McConnell, who is the leader of the majority here in the United States Senate, is, where have you been for the last 10 and a half weeks? Where is the Republican alternative, the Republican substitute? Why have we not seen that come forward and a real negotiation take place between the House and the Senate? Well, for the longest time, Senator McConnell told us he just did not feel, quote, a sense of urgency to take up this matter. Did not feel a sense of urgency. Well, history was made in the Senate chamber this last Monday because Senator McConnell came to the floor and actually used the word urgent. Finally, urgency is stirring in his loins, and he announced this week a Republican alternative, but not quite. What he announced was a series of bills to be introduced by the Republican side. A series of bills. We are just days away. We are days away from the situation where these issues are expiring, like unemployment assistance. And yet, in this circumstance, we are dealing with a problem where we do not have alternatives from the Republican side. Oh, we have some. And one was addressed this morning when it came to the unemployment assistance. Understand what happened last March 26 when we passed the CARES Act. This bill passed 96-0 in the Senate chamber. Unanimous, bipartisan. But when we sat down to establish the amount of money to be given to unemployed workers in America, we ran into a problem, one we didn't anticipate. The Secretary of Labor in the Trump administration, Secretary Scalia, came to us, sat down at a table and said, you have a lot of interesting formulas when it comes to unemployment compensation, but just remember the reality. And the reality is that 50 different states have 50 different computer systems, some of which are very modern and up to speed, and others are ancient and not up to speed. When you start coming up with complex federal formulas for sending money to unemployed workers in these states, you're going to run into 50 different reactions. And that's exactly what we faced. So the alternative was simple. We either gave a flat dollar amount in the federal unemployment benefit supplement, or we just wondered what the states might do with any other formula. So the decision was made with the White House, with the Republicans, for the $600 a week federal supplement to unemployment. There was argument on the floor that some workers may come out ahead if that happens. Well, undoubtedly that might be the case because the federal supplement was in addition to whatever a person qualified for state unemployment. And each state has a different formula for state unemployment assistance, and each worker has a different work experience and salary experience. But we went forward believing that we needed to do something dramatic and significant for the economy, And the first place to start was with unemployed workers. And economists will tell you when you're facing a recession, when there's a lack of consumer demand, the first dollar you want to hand out as a government is to an unemployed worker. You know they're going to spend it. They have to spend it to pay the rent or the mortgage, utility bills, put food on the table, clothes on the kids, pay for health insurance. So we put the money into the economy and it worked. We managed to slow the decline of the economy, even though we see more unemployment still coming around. It would have been much worse if we hadn't made this commitment and investment in unemployment benefits. So now, with the expiration of this federal unemployment benefit program on July the 31st, just a few days away, the question is, what will we replace it with? Democrats proposed in the HEROES Act in the House that we extend the current program to the end of this year. That is certainly a direct way to deal with this, and one that would provide assistance to these families that would continue. The Republicans have come up with a much different approach. What they have suggested is we take the $600 a week federal supplement and reduce it to $200 a week. And then by October 1st, we require the states to implement a program that would give the unemployed worker 70% of their last wage. They have obviously ignored what Secretary Scalia told us just a few months ago, and that is that the states would run into a terrible challenge trying to meet this new Republican standard of 70% of your last paycheck. We were told we couldn't do that back in March. Has the landscape changed so much when it comes to state computer systems? I doubt it. I doubt it very much. In Illinois, we have a good system, but it's been dramatically overwhelmed by the federal supplemental payment and the new pandemic unemployment insurance and other provisions which we passed in Washington. So to think that we can move to a new formula in Illinois while meeting our current obligations is very difficult in our state, which we think is more modern than some. Having said that, though, the Republicans have argued that if by October 1st you can't provide 70% by formula to the unemployed workers, I suppose they'll go back to the $200 a week. It's unclear. So what's behind this? What's at the heart of this? Well, there are several things that I think need to be noted on the floor. Here is the assumption. Listen to this. You've heard it over and over, and we heard it again this morning. The assumption that has been made by the Republicans in their approach to unemployment insurance. They assume that if people are receiving $600 a week in a federal supplement to unemployment, that they're going to refuse to go back to work, even when offered a job. They're making more money to stay home than they did on the job. At least that's what's been repeated over and over again. Madam President, this morning I'd like to put in the record an article from the Yale News. And this Yale study, which was just released this week, says, the Yale study finds expanded jobless benefits did not reduce employment. Exactly the opposite of what we've heard over and over again from the Republican side. This report from Yale economists said as follows. It found that workers receiving larger increases in unemployment benefits experienced very similar gains in employment by early May relative to workers with less generous benefit increases. People with more generous expanded benefits also resume working at a similar or slightly quicker rate than others did, according to the report. Quote, the data do not show a relationship between benefit generosity and employment path under the CARES Act, which could be due to the collapse of labor demand during the COVID-19 crisis. Put in simple terms, there aren't that many jobs out there looking for workers. And as it turns out, some workers, unemployed, have gone back to work, even though they might make slightly less than they did under unemployment. Why? The reason's obvious. Unemployment is a temporary benefit. Unemployment may not be as good and generous as what a person has in the workplace when you count the benefits that come with some jobs. And ultimately, many workers, unemployed today, want to get back to work. We should not assume, as some politicians do, that if a person is unemployed, they must be lazy. With 47 million unemployed Americans, that is hardly the case. And certainly when it comes to whether or not people have the incentive to go back to work, I believe most Americans do want to work. And the notion that we have to change the whole system for fear that some might not is definitely unfair. Let me just say that as we move forward with this, I see a colleague on the floor seeking recognition in a few minutes. As we move forward with this attempt to deal with the economy, we have to face the reality. And the reality is, as made clear by the chairman of the Federal Reserve, that if we take our foot off the accelerator right now, we're going to plunge over the cliff in a deeper economic mess than we're in today. They are trying by every means in monetary policy and the interest rates to enliven this economy and create an environment where it may reopen soon, and I hope that happens. But if we take the Republican approach, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, it's not going to work. We're going to find ourselves with a recession that's even worse. And for those deficit hawks, how badly do you think our deficit will look if we face an even deeper recession? It's going to get worse, and dramatically so. Shouldn't our first obligation be to the workers across America who've lost their jobs so they can keep their families together? This notion of cutting the federal benefit from $600 a week to $200 a week, I can guarantee you, will mean much more traffic and activity at the food pantries around America as these unemployed families try to keep things together. And then there's a proposal from the Republican side for a 3-martini lunch federal tax break. 3-martini lunch, is that the way out of our economic morass? And at the same time they're encouraging the 3-martini lunch federal tax break, they won't give any additional assistance to those who are receiving SNAP benefits. Those low-income Americans who are needing some help just to feed their families. It seems that things are upside down. The last point I'll make is this. Senator McConnell has said repeatedly for months, nothing is going to happen in the Senate, nothing, to help anybody in America unless he gets his wish to give immunity to American corporations from coronavirus lawsuits. Finally, we get to see his proposal. It was released this week. I want to tell you, it is the most dramatic tort reform proposal I've seen since I've served in the United States Senate. It basically takes away the rights of workers as well as those who are customers in businesses from recovering under a coronavirus lawsuit. It lowers the standard of care that is required of businesses to a level which basically will not protect Americans that face this pandemic across the country. And at the same time, it is providing assistance and relief. It is unfortunately creating an environment where some businesses, unfortunately, will not be as careful as they should be in the way they conduct their businesses with the customers and their employees. We know that we face a challenge here with this pandemic, but giving this kind of corporate break when it comes to immunity and liability only will make things more dangerous for customers and employees across the United States of America. And let me say a word about what has been said on the floor over and over again by Senator Cornyn and Senator McConnell, the so-called tsunami of lawsuits, the epidemic of frivolous lawsuits, the trial lawyers on parade to the courthouse because of this pandemic. Well, we've checked every lawsuit filed in the United States this year that mentions the word coronavirus or COVID-19. Do you know how many medical malpractice cases have been filed so far this calendar year with this so-called tsunami of lawsuits? 6. And how many personal injury cases have been filed this year mentioning COVID-19 or coronavirus? This epidemic, this flood of lawsuits, 15 across the entire United States of America. It's an imaginary problem that they are creating at this point. We can deal with it. 28 states have already by changing their state laws, but giving immunity to corporations from coronavirus lawsuits will not make us safer, will not make the workplace safer for workers or the business safer for customers. If we're going to restore consumer confidence, everybody has to pull together. We ought to have standards established by the CDC based on public health and not politics. And businesses, conscientious businesses, I am sure will follow those standards because they do care. Currently, we don't have these standards, and this effort will make it even less likely that we will. I yield the floor.